Yeah. Okay. How many of you see just a bunch of dots or something other than a bunch of dots? Yeah. A dog. All right. Yeah. I think we have solved the problem. That's it. That's the lesson here today, guys. Now better, right? So when parts move together, it informs our brain to perceive the entity as a whole. It was even before, but now it's better, right? The whole is other than the sum of the parts, which is a fancy way of saying that, whatever our eyes see, the mind informs us by seeing a series of things as a whole, right? Or even simpler than that, people interpret complex images as the simplest forms possible, right? So you don't see, random segmented rings or sections of a circle. You see them as interlocking rings, which is probably why the logo is good. And when you have those aha moments that, oh, okay, I see something interesting happening, right? Okay, I'll drop the big word, Gestalt. Don't worry, it's German. But in the 1920s, three German psychologists came up with a set of principles that explain like how our brain processes the things we see, and because we have an innate need to perceive things as as a unified structure, as a good figure, right? Loading bar, loading circle. Yeah, we have seen this. Fun fact: nothing is moving here. This is known as the five phenomenon, which was discovered in the 1912 by Max Wertheimer, one of those psychologists, and this marked the birth of the Gestalt principles. So he found out that when you show a series of objects in quick succession, such that your brain cannot perceive them as individual elements, an apparent motion arises, which is why this works, right? Even if you're not a motion designer, you can design motion like this. Good afternoon, everyone. I am an information designer, a web developer, a data journalist, and some other stuff at work. I craft data-driven pieces that help narrate important stories visually. Over the past 7 years, I have worked on a variety of news topics ranging from Delhi's winter pollution, the Chandrayaan 2 mission, and a bunch of wars. It seems like a common thing in Europe these days. And then, not all bad. Some fun stuff like the Eurovision Song Contest. The one on the second on the left in the first row column, second row. Songs visualized as flowers, and other stuff like FIFA World Cup 2022. Now, over the years, I have realized the importance of some of these fundamentals. So I come from an engineering and design background, and then I realized, it's time to stop fighting and start doing something better. And these fundamentals kind of inform how, no matter what kind of data or information you handle, all of that can be made really impactful by making choices which seem intuitive, but when you make them consciously, they can have a good impact. Also, like if you are just providing feedback, design feedback to someone, you can say more than just saying, "Oh, the vibe feels off." The eyes have it, guys. Yeah. A bunch of dots, but a square, right? That's the first principle, the power of simplicity. We see whatever is the simplest thing to process because our brains are lazy. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, something interesting happens when we highlight one thing, right? You see the purple dot first, standing out in the crowd, right? So let me tell you something. When we look at any kind of image, even before we make like conscious choices about what the content is, within like less than 500 milliseconds, our eyes and brain processes something uh, which are known as which is known as pre-attentive processing, and those things that we perceive are like the retinal or pre-attentive variables, things like size, shape, color, motion, right? So they are really useful to attract our attention. And basically, because of those things, we have all the different kinds of chart forms and visualizations that exist out there. So one example, this is a chart showing number of protests, during the Israel-Palestine war. Uh, it could have been a bar chart, yes, but there are other nuances to it. For example, showing them as crowds kind of goes with the visual metaphor of each and every protest counts, and then you have dots standing out of them, which shows extra layer of information, and then you have annotations and stuff. Finally, we have a bar chart in the presentation. This shows the number of Ukraine's refugees compared to population of cities. So one reason it works out is because the highlight stands out. You may find something like this from if you get the output from any standard data viz tool out there. But one of the reasons, besides like not attracting our attention or attracting our attention to everything, it's also not factually very accurate because those are the refugee numbers, whereas the rest of them are population, right? So they are like similar but different quantities. Or you may think that, I'll put some flair to it. Don't. These are columns of dots. Yeah. Why? Because things that look similar are probably together, right? Now, which one looks organized? The one on the left or the right? For the left, let's see hands. And the right? Yeah. Well, fun fact, yes, both of them are organized, but you feel the left one is more organized, or you feel they are organized much before you realize the right one is, because retinal variables, right? So when we are processing things, the important takeaway is that some of those things are more easily processed. So for example, color trumps shape. So when you see organization by color, you feel like, that's more organized. And that's how we have heat maps where blocks of different shapes. This is showing air pollution in Delhi, and it gives you a nice overview of which days or how prevalent something is. Other important use of colors across different shapes and sizes is probably maps. These are called choropleth maps, where different colors are assigned to different sections of the data and places are colored accordingly. This could also have been a bar chart, but one thing this does is it adds the nuance of geography to it. So you get, 2 for 1. Uh, but also a word of caution in this case is just because how we perceive mass, something that may be lost not in this context, but when designing choropleths is if you are coloring a small shape versus a large shape with the same color, which is like extremely bright, then you may give an unnecessary level of importance to something that isn't probably that way. So again, everything comes with caveats, but guys. Yeah, they're not in the same block anymore. The power of nearness. Things that are together are read together. This is an example from our COVID tracker. This is called a bee swarm plot, where basically different quantities are visualized as clusters, and the clusters give you an idea of where things are. So, I mean, this is after we stopped collecting the data, but when the data was being updated live, you could see how in the countries in the Europe and the Americas, they were much towards the right, and whereas in Africa and Asia and were much. So this was literally a visualization of the ongoing vaccine race, right? Another chart, waffle chart. Yeah, we have come up with very nice names. Yeah. Yeah. So one important thing here is decisions like how much space should you assign to the space between the bars or between the two facets where you have Trump years and Biden years, and then the spacing between the labels, the hierarchy of the text. All of these things are very easy to get wrong, and when that happens, of course, like it's not very easy to read, but you have to find the sweet spot. So the idea is you have to all those decisions that seem intuitive are conscious choices, which makes it seem effortless. The other thing about waffle charts is like you get the contrast too high or you make the spacing too wide, you get optical illusions, yeah. Draw a box, you start seeing that as it together. So now you see, even these principles can like trump one another. So before we had proximity, but now once we put a box around it, you see that as an entity, despite the space in between them, right? That's the power of enclosure. This is a visualization showing how many people attended the Kumbh, the scale of the entire thing. Uh, a petal shows 10,000 people, a bunch of flowers shows 10 lakh people, and the whole thing shows the busiest day, which had like 76.4 million people. And then you draw a boundary around it and showing that, compared to that, 22.85 is the population of Delhi. The enclosure plays a very important role while making maps. There's so many lines and stuff. You have to really find out the level of detail you need because you see things, because they actually take a lot of your attention. Yeah, there's something similar between happening on the left and right. That's our desire for rhythm. We try to see things balanced, symmetry. One of the use cases are charts where you have like population pyramid or poles, yes and no. So the fact that anything is skewed to one side immediately grabs your attention that, oh, it should be something different. This is also a bar chart, but it has been realigned to make it look like actually the number of nuclear reactors that are going to be operational in the next couple of decades is dying out, right? So you can take something as simple as a bar chart and do something interesting to make it stand out. Now, when we put two boxes, the symmetry becomes more obvious, right? Right. So with great power comes great responsibility, right? Uh, this is a square, right? So this is the law of closure. It's seeing things that are probably important but isn't there, just like relationships. But it helps. So one example is charts where you're trying to show the balance of trade or something like this. So while the individual lines are important, but the real takeaway here is the space between those lines, the balance of import and exports. So that's one way you can use this law to highlight different parts of a visual. Even the cat knows it. I'm not going to wait for it to sit, but they are random, but if you look closely, they kind of represent an direction, arrows. That's because our eyes want to follow the path of least resistance, right? We seek continuity, like this. This is courtesy of my colleague and friend Travis. Uh, that guy must be really tall. So even when we have a line chart, just because we can highlight things with color, you do follow the lines and can see, like even if we have line charts that have breaks, you still read them as one and see, where data is missing. Continuity doesn't only apply in terms of simple, obvious shapes, but it also applies to colors, right? So this is a earthquake shake map where the gradient shows how much of a shake there was from the epicenter to the other. So when you perceive color like this, you want to read them as a continuous thing, but if the data is not continuous, the one that you have mapped, then cognitive dissonance happens, like you're seeing something, but you are supposed to see something else. And we're going to talk about color. So our famous color scale, the rainbow, you know. Now, when we're talking about continuity, our brain perceives a continuous thing in two ways. One is uh, the ordering of color and the ordering or color, which we mean as hue in design terms, and the lightness or the brightness of color. Now, what happens is if I rearrange that color scale by hue, as in the color scale or the color wheel, or in terms of the lightness, you see the order is different. So you basically don't know how people are going to read it, right? And that's why such scales are problematic, which is why you have lots of different ways to visualize that. You can have color gradients of one color, multiple colors, three colors. You can have diverging color scales. Another problematic thing is if your data is not diverging, like temperature, it goes above and below zero. But let's say some data goes from 0 to 100 and you use a diverging scale where the data doesn't really have a midpoint. So that is also problematic, right? Okay. Are they, you see these bars of dots, at least you see the purples first, right? That's what we see when things stand out, right? The figure and ground relationship. What do you see? People, vase, nothing? Yeah, people. If you squint, you'll see that they're trying to kiss each other, but okay. So this is called a Rubin's vase, which has, you can see both of them depending on how your mind works. And this is a bistable relationship, which is good for optical illusions, but not so much for data viz, unless that's what you want to do. Uh, Simple example, a map, right? We have ground, which is colored as ground, and you read that as the main thing that you have to read on a piece of white paper. Things get interesting when you change the color. When it's in a dark mode, you can remove, and this is a story where the action is happening in the ocean. So that's what I want to be highlighted in a dark background, and that's what, flipping the figure and ground relationship, which is a very powerful tool. Talking about colors again, these are experiments by Joseph Albers from his book Interaction of Color. Now you see why I talk about this is because the figure ground relationship varies a lot, like the contrast varies a lot depending on both of them. So in each of those, the greens, they are the same green, but when you change the background, and same for the right, the grays and the central square is the same color. But when you change things around, how much you perceive the central color as green or gray changes. So it's all relative, guys. Example, if you're making a chart that has multiple categorical colors on a dark background, so here the red is the highlight, something that you should be alarmed about. And then there's the gray, which is closer to the background, which is probably missing data or no data or something not important. But imagine if I do that on a white background, you really don't know which is a higher value, which is something you should be, which is the figure here, right? So in that case, you probably need to switch things up, change things. The reason I bring this up is in a world where we are very fascinated by dark mode and light mode, sometimes systems automatically come with that. So your designs may have unintended variations when people are looking at it and on the end systems, and something to be conscious about. Talking about colors, the other important thing is we are not all the same, right? There's something, some people can have issues perceiving the contrast between red and green, perceiving blue, perceiving contrast in general or perceiving color in general, right? So one of the most talked about things about when we talk about accessibility in design or even like data viz design, when we're relying on colors to show some data, it really needs to stand out. So the one on the top is a normal version, the one below that is a red-green color blind version, and you see how the colors are different. So when you're designing, it's often a good idea to check your designs if they, work across those things. Whatever tool you have, there are lots of online tools that you can use to check that, and and a good rule of thumb is sometimes to design in grayscale because colors you add later, and that's when it's going to work across no matter what happens, which is why if you have too many colors you can switch to patterns and stuff to actually distinguish. Like you can look at old designs from those black and white textbooks and see how people have done so many amazing visualizations without using one or two colors, right? Guide your viewer's attention effortlessly to what matters most using good contrast, which can be size, shape, color, simplicity, containment, highlights, and typography. So what I mean simplicity is sometimes you don't need to have long scales, long axis lines. Sometimes you can fade out your axis labels to the background using a lighter color. Sometimes you can use highlight. So adding highlight doesn't always mean adding upon highlight. Sometimes you add highlight by removing something from the background, from the ground as well, right? It's like showing how this stick is long is by short by putting another longer stick next to it, right? And talking about typography, yeah. So how you decide the font sizes in your chart, how you put annotations, what colors you use in the text, all of those play a very important role in how your chart is going to be read and how fast it's going to be read accurately. And then, like all good things, must be balanced. So how do you balance a composition? You have position, weight, direction of visual elements, mathematical stuff. And then you have the weight of the perceptual forces. So you have mass, anything that looks heavy is heavy. And then you have attention. And in a composition, you can have different ways in which you can balance things. This is an example of a chart where when you position the position of annotations, the colors used, the position of labels, the hierarchy of the labels, all of these help you achieve a balance, right? Like sometimes that level of pixel pushing in the last is what makes a difference between a good chart and a very good chart. Form follows function, we have heard that, in passing. If not, you hear it now. But when it comes to data viz, I like to frame it in this way. Form follows how people read and perceive. Function follows what people need to know, right? So what people need to know is a very interesting thing, like because this also came up in a panel discussion earlier. Like sometimes we don't know who our audience is, like especially when you're doing it for journalistic purposes, right? It's everybody. So how do you account for things? So there is no user research as such, like this is my end user who's going to read it. So sometimes you have to make the decision of what people need to know from the data that you have. There can be different ways to do that. And this is an example of a simple data set. This is a project called the 100 Data Viz project, where you have a data set which is not huge. Like you may think that to have lots of variations of a visualization, you need a really huge data set, but just 2 rows and 3 columns. And these are 100 different visualization, each showing different things, right? By the way, I've put links to all of these so you can take a look at all of these later on, so don't worry. And then the first question, how people read and perceive, that's also something we're trying to answer today, right? So rule of thumb, if it doesn't look right, it probably isn't going to be read or understood right, right? Like intuition works. And for intuition, it's important to develop taste and blah, blah, blah. If you want to hear more about this, you can go to LinkedIn. People are always talking about it. Uh, don't challenge, don't create chaos in the name of creativity. Don't always depend on default output of softwares, right? Like this is almost like that Guardians of the Galaxy meme. If you know, you know. This is, okay, one thing I want to talk about, we already spoke about diverging scales. Like the same things happens, like the data is not diverging, the colors are diverging, like what is happening? This, I mean, we're not gonna talk about truncated y-axis here, that's beyond the scope of today. But what we're gonna talk about is when you put human figures on a height chart, now you measure human height from the feet to the head or vice versa, right? But if you truncate the chart, what is like, this doesn't look right, like what's happening in India, like what's wrong? Yeah. And the other thing about putting these pictograms, these icons, you cannot just scale them in one direction. So when you scale them in both directions, like the mass of the biggest icon compared to the smallest one is less. So somehow it makes you feel almost, I don't know, a lot of things. Here's another example. Again, lots of issues with this, starting from the positioning of the labels. Like the total applications is not just the orange one, it's the entire thing, right? But okay, we know, we have learned about proximity and stuff. You see the rejection for after phone interview, it's 1, right? But if I did not have any labels, could you guess like how many rejections there were? Probably more than 1, right? So what height should your chart be, right? How thick should your lines be? How big should your circles be? So that definitely doesn't look like 1, right? So these are very important decisions that can change how your chart looks. For example, if you have a bar chart where the bars are too wide, your brain doesn't process it, compare just lengths. They start comparing areas, and that's where those, blunt bar charts doesn't work. They work more as area charts, and they're not nice to look at. Another example of probably dashboards, like depending on what you want the people to see, like line charts have their own role, area charts have their own role, but if the goal is to compare in a set, probably the area charts give you a better comparison of which ones are uh, uh, are more in quantity and less. Like one of the reasons could be the figure ground, because when you have mass against in the midst of all the lines, that does a better job of doing this. Another example, this is, so I'll tell you what's wrong with it. All in good intent, by the way. I think like none of them wanted to mislead people. So the problem is the color scale changes when the data changes, right? So if you have a dynamic dashboard where everything is automated, somehow everything looks red and also darker red. Now the thing is, we come with like preconceived notions of what colors mean, like dark red means alarming. Like if I show you light color and dark color, you'll tell me by default that darker means more value or something, right? So it fails when it's a dynamic viz, right? So gestalt principles are fairly universal because these are rooted in the way human brain is wired to perceive and interpret visual information, but they may be subject to nuances based on social, cultural, and perceptual differences. We spoke about the use of red color. We spoke about the use of about color blindness. If people cannot even see your color, what meaning will they derive from it? And symbols, they are very, very powerful things, right? Right. The Dalmatian example on the first slide. Like if none of you had ever seen a Dalmatian, you wouldn't have been able to understand that that's a dog, right? So sometimes it may not work. Then again, the example of the flower petals as a visual metaphor to show people, right? Like that works exactly because Kumbh is a religious festival, and then the added visual metaphor, like those could have been dots, but by adding that extra layer of visual metaphor, you humanize the data, and then that adds to the aha-ness of your, well, I should quote that, aha-ness of your database. So yeah, you should be aware of how people are going to feel about your database, right? This is an example of, again, showing immigration into Europe, right? Now, when you look at these, first of all, that red is alarming, like, oh, is Europe being invaded? Uh, those arrows, they are reminiscent of like war maps. This is by some studio, again, I have shared the link but later on. But yeah, these are, makes you feel scared. But a simple redesign by changing the color, by not using arrows, by showing dots, or maybe not even making a map in the first place, you can take out. So just the way you can add metaphors and make things more impressive, improper use of that can also create like tap into our negative biases and connotations. So yeah, just be aware of that. So how much time do we have? Yeah, okay, perfect. So to summarize, I'll drink some water first. Things that are separate yet simply seen as a whole, when one stands out, it plays an important role. The ones alike are definitely partners in crime, even when they vary in shape, size, and prime. In nearness, mental connections are formed, as if space itself, by meaning, is warmed. When bound by a border, our attention is spun. What felt scattered, we now see them as one. Where halves unite, it speaks in a silent song. Our desire for rhythm finds peace that belongs. Even emptiness speaks louder than the noise when the closure we seek in the void gets a voice. The threads that weave seamlessly with grace often guides our attention through time and space. Foreground and background in a delicate blend, what the eyes perceive becomes the truth in the end. Thank you. Thank you, slide, because I have to put one. Also, if you scan this QR code, you're gonna get a link to all the chart examples and the stories that I've shared, so, and some stuff to get in touch. I'm here throughout the rest of the day, so you can come say hello or not. Thank you.